Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this iteration of the On Gaza speaker series. It's a series that was started in the fall of 2023 by Diana Allen, an anthropologist and a filmmaker who unfortunately cannot be here with us today because she's at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University. The On Gaza series is co-sponsored by the Critical Media Lab, the Research Group on Democracy, Space and Technology of the Jan P. Lind Center, the Institute of Islamic Studies, and the Montreal Ottoman Turkish Studies Workshop at McGill University. So thank you for making this series and this particular session possible. I would also like to thank Ipek and Will for inviting me today to introduce our distinguished speaker. And thanks are also in order to Jean-Félix Caron and Nada Nasser from the Lind Center for all their helps with all things logistics. And also for those of you who are joining us remotely, watching from your home or your office, the live streaming is made possible by the Critical Media Lab's Associate Director, Julian Levin, so thank you for that as well. In 1984, in the wake of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, Edward Said published one of his landmark essays, Permission to Narrate, in the London Review of Books, critiquing the Western world's unbridled support for Israel. While Israel and its allies narrated the 1982 war from their own perspectives, Palestinians were repeatedly denied the right to narrate their own history and even their very existence. Nearly 4 decades later, we are confronted with the same political, ideological, and above all, historical problem on this question of Palestine. How is it that despite the live streaming of horrors and the obscenity, the facts still do not speak for themselves? This question is especially pressing in contexts like Canada, and more importantly, the United States, a country that continues to provide unwavering moral, financial, and military support for Israel. I'm honored this afternoon to introduce Professor Ussama Makdisi, a historian of America in the Arab world and a committed chronicler of the politics of pluralism and coexistence in the Ottoman Empire and the Arab region. By calling history into question, Professor Makdisi's work helps us understand how colonialism, marked by acts of genocide, justified in the name of defending civilization, can be legitimized today, and how what has been deemed ethically unbearable and relegated to the past can become morally tolerated and is actually re-emerging. Dr. Makdisi is currently a professor of history and Chancellor's chair at the University of California, Berkeley. He has also recently been named the inaugural May Ziadeh Chair in Palestinian and Arab Studies, which will be one of North America's few Palestinian Arab Studies programs. Previously, Professor Makdisi served as a professor of history and was the first holder of the Arab American Educational Foundational Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston. He has received several awards and fellowships, including being named a Carnegie Scholar in 2009, serving as an invited resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin in 2012-2013, and as a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin after being awarded the Berlin Prize in 2018. Professor Makdisi is the author of several acclaimed and award-winning books. For more than 3 decades now, he has published extensively on Ottoman history, the role of US missionaries in the Arab region, and the development of modern Arab political cultures. Among many things, his work has helped create a new research agenda for the study of sectarianism, not as a violent primordial tie or a vestige of pre-modern communal bonds, but rather as a complex byproduct of modernization and emancipatory politics. His most recent book, Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World, was published in 2019 by the University of California Press. For the past year, Dr. Makdisi has been co-hosting a new podcast called Makdisi Streets with his brothers, Professors Sari and Karim Makdisi, named after one of Beirut's most illustrious and busy streets. For those of you who know Beirut, The podcast provides insight into history and politics by looking at contemporary events. If you haven't tuned in, I highly encourage you to do so. Finally, I want to end my introduction by returning to the significance of Professor Makdisi's recent appointment as the inaugural Mayziede Chair in Palestinian and Arab Studies at Berkeley. This appointment and the program itself underscore the imperative to recenter Palestinian history in light of the ongoing destruction of Palestinian cultural heritage and Israel's deliberate targeting of higher education in Gaza, including the killing of professors, administrators, and students. To my mind, it also brings the story of Mayziede herself, the feminist Nahda intellectual and literary figure. In 1936, Mayziede was admitted to the Asfouriye Psychiatric Hospital in Beirut because her cousin had actually accused her of madness, while what was at stake were inheritance issues. And to prove her sanity, Mayziede was then asked to deliver a public lecture at the American University of Beirut, showcasing her intellectual capacities and rational ability to think to the lawyers and the psychiatrists present. Perhaps this is what the current conjuncture demands, what the Burkinabe revolutionary Thomas Sankara referred to as a certain amount of madness. The sentiment resonates deeply in the context of Dr. Makdisi's scholarly engagement and the urgent need for new narratives surrounding Palestinian history and culture. And so without further ado, Dr. Makdisi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cynthia Kreshati, who should have, of course, who was way too generous with that introduction, but also I really do appreciate the sincerity and the kindness and generosity of your summary. And also, of course, I'd like to thank Professor Will Roberts and also Professor Ipek Chureli. Is Ipek there? Yeah, I can barely see. And everyone else here at McGill for this invitation to come and speak, as well as Diana Allen, who organized, as Cynthia just mentioned, the On Gaza speaker series. I'd also like to say, and everyone else who's helped organize this event. I know there are many people, so I'm deeply, deeply grateful to each and every one of you. And of course, I'm grateful to all of you for coming out this evening to listen to a lecture on history involving and relating what's going on now with what's happened in the past and what's happened in the past to what's going on now. But I'd also like to say I'm especially honored because my niece is in this room. We have a family, as Cynthia mentioned, of professors. And one of the nicest things is always going to places and seeing family members. So my niece, who's a third year, here at McGill in sociology, majoring in sociology. I couldn't help it. We tried history, but sociology is where it is. And so I'm very happy to see Maisa here. Maisa, it's great to see you. And thank you, everybody. So that's the positive part. Now, the other part. What more, honestly, is there to say? What more is there to say? For over a year now, each of us has witnessed, all of us have witnessed, the most extreme, horrifying, explicit, intense, and relentless bombardment of an concentrated urban space in modern history. We've witnessed, live streamed, on our phones, on whatever the media that we consume, the fastest deliberate starvation of any population in recorded history. We have witnessed the greatest number of journalists killed in any conflict anywhere in the world. We have witnessed the greatest number of UN staff killed in any conflict since the founding of the UN. We have witnessed, as far as I'm aware, the greatest number of child amputees in any modern war. We have witnessed the relentless targeting by Israel of doctors, teachers, as Cynthia mentioned, and the destruction of every single university in Gaza, unprecedented in modern times. But beyond the obliteration of an entire society and people, we have also had to endure, and this I know, me personally at Berkeley, but all of you here at McGill and in Canada, I'm sure, the spectacle of Western governments allegedly democratic governments, institutions, and closest to home, our academic colleagues and leaders who've justified genocide or perpetrated gaslighting on a genocidal scale. Because the reality is that Israel no longer even pretends when it comes to the mass murder in Gaza, the bombing of refugee camps, the bombing of shelters, the bombing of schools that takes place virtually every day. Israel no longer even pretends that it is not terrorizing a million people, a million children, that it is not bombing hospitals, doesn't even pretend to say Hamas is hiding underneath anymore. It just does the bombing. It rounds up the doctors, it rounds up the patients, it strips the men to their underwear and sends them in this constant ethnic cleansing. It no longer pretends, and you can see it on your phones, the destruction of entire apartment blocks, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon now. And as I said, the massacring of Palestinians day in, day out, as well as Lebanese now. The Israeli airstrike on the Israeli airstrike that I know many of us watched, or at least saw the videos of, at 1:30 a.m. on October 15th, provided one of the most unbearable and haunting images of the genocide thus far. That of the 19-year-old young man, Sha'ban Ahmad al-Dalu, burning alive in a courtyard of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Aqsa Hospital, while in his tent, still attached to the IV line, because he had been previously wounded. Yet both his murder and killing, and the Israeli killing of the 6-year-old Hind Rajab, trapped in a shot-up car months before, have been passed over in the West, in the official West, as a tragedy, at best, for which Palestinians themselves are to be blamed. We have witnessed, in short, a stunning lack of empathy, an explicit devaluation of human life, non-Western human life, Arab life, Palestinian, Lebanese life, Muslim life, across the liberal Western world that has for so long trumpeted how much it has reckoned with its own racist past, especially when it comes to indigenous populations and the question of slavery in the United States. At the same time as the same liberal West continues to deny others their past, present, and future. All the more reason, therefore, at the beginning here to insist on evoking both people and a past that have been so relentlessly denigrated and denied across the official West. I go back to history not to avoid talking about the horrors of what is happening today and what has been happening today, but rather to underscore a crucial point. There is an essential step in the dehumanization of Palestinians and Lebanese and others is not only the representation as dangerous, as shadowy, all the words and all the terms that you know, as terroristic, as oriental, as barbarians, as all these different things, but also, just as importantly, their dehistoricization. In other words, the rendering of Palestinians, Lebanese, Arabs, Muslims, as peoples without history, peoples without, in other words, ethical or political importance, peoples whose past and therefore present and future can be overwritten by a narrative that valorizes the idea of a Jewish state in a multi-religious world, irrespective of the extraordinary suffering that such a state and the ideology of this state entails for millions of non-Jewish men, women, and children, in other words, Muslim and Christian men, women, and children, as well as, of course, Jewish men, women, and children as well. The corollary to this is also true. Rehistoricizing Palestinians is a crucial aspect of reclaiming their humanity. This will not, of course, stop the genocide. Nothing we do is going to stop the extreme use of force and the violence and the brutality that's unfolding. But it will, at least I hope, continue or contribute to sort of recording and to insisting on an extraordinary archive that is being collected every single day and is being collected every single day over the past year, but really for the past 75 years. An archive that is damning in its sort of exposition of depravity, and that is surely going to scar each and every one of us for the rest of our lives. And ideally, I hope, in the most optimistic version of myself, ideally I hope contribute to at least a tiny piece, as we all do each in our own way, to this sort of long tapestry of justice that is in fact going to be and is being painstakingly stitched together through the collective effort of so many people around the world who actually know and can see what is going on in Gaza and in Lebanon and know full well that it is unconscionable, unacceptable, and truly monstrous. So let us return now to some history, as in the twilight of the Ottoman era, when neither Israel nor any of the Arab states existed as modern independent states, but when people of many different faiths coexisted in what was then, of course, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, of course, was a multi-religious state polity, and in the Mashriq, in other words, the Arab East, it was a multi-religious empire and a polity in which people, especially in what is today Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, this entire region, in which the people of different faiths were unlike today, were actually involved in these extraordinary debates. And there's an exhibit actually that my colleague Diala mentioned here in the Islamic Sciences about the Nahda, the idea that the Arab world or the Arab East was involved in a renaissance in the late 19th century, middle to late 19th century, into the 20th century, a renaissance in which people of different faiths were brimming with this idea that they could actually shape their own futures. They weren't exactly sure about the specific contours of this future. Some were more religious, some were more secular, some were more pious, some were less interested in religion and public life. I mean, there were these massive debates that took place, but there was a renaissance of education, there was a renaissance of literary societies, there was a growth of feminism, there was a growth of newspapers, and so on and so forth. All this was happening in the 19th century, late Ottoman Empire. Palestinians, in other words, the people who live in Palestine, Palestinians, like other peoples in the late 19th century, Mashriq, were not, and this is the crucial point that everyone needs to understand, Palestinians were not living their lives waiting for colonialism to unfold. Palestinian men and women, in other words, lived, loved, quarreled, argued like any other people in the region. Most, as you know, were Muslim. Others were Eastern or Sephardic or Arab Jews. Many were Christian, of course, of various Eastern Christian and more recently Protestant denominations. So my great-grandfather, Shukri Musa, in fact, was one of these converts to Protestantism from Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He opened the first, ironically, especially given the politics of the United States today, he opened the first Baptist church in Nazareth after a trip that took him from his native Safad to Texas, to Waco, in fact. We laughed, but it's true. He ended up in Waco. He converted to baptism. He became a Baptist, in other words. And he returned to Palestine in 1910, and to his wife, who bore him a daughter in 1914, my maternal grandmother, Hilda Musa Said, who bore her husband, William, who was from Jerusalem, Said, 5 children who survived into adulthood. Edward was the eldest, followed by Rosemary, then Jean was my mother, born in Jerusalem in 1940, then Joyce, and finally Grace. Most, of course, did not travel nearly as far as my great-grandfather. Rather, they lived out their lives in an interconnected Mashriq that for centuries had linked cities such as Damascus, Akka, Saida, Sidon, in other words, Haifa, Beirut, Tripoli, Aleppo, Bethlehem, Jaffa, and Nablus, and all their hinterlands together. Like every other Palestinian man and woman, in other words, there was no need for my great-grandfather or his wife or his children to explain the obviousness of their humanity or the naturalness of their attachment to the land from which they came. There was no need for narrative in that sense. And as my mother always reminds us, our history lies in our names. And so my name is Makdisi, which means of Jerusalem, for those who don't know Arabic, even though that's my father's name, and my father is Lebanese. My sister-in-law, one of my sisters-in-law, Maisa's mother, is Beiruti, and Palestinian from Jaffa, but called Beiruti. And my other sister-in-law is called Dimish'i, which means of Damascus, and she's Lebanese. And so in other words, even in the names, you get these connections, which underscore something incredibly beautiful and powerful and potent that we have to maintain sight of. Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, these regions were not always so divided in the way they are today. When my great-grandfather was a young man of 26, however, a Jewish Zionist journalist in Vienna by the name of Theodor Herzl wrote and published his 1896 The Jewish State. Herzl, who of course didn't know any native Middle Eastern language and had not been, as far as I'm aware, to Palestine, wrote this book called The Jewish State. He wrote it, of course, in German, as you all know, trying to convince his German language readers, Jews in Europe more broadly, and Christian European statesmen whose support he coveted, why a Jewish national state established in faraway Palestine or Argentina, he mused, had to be done to combat European anti-Semitism. He insisted that such a modern state would constitute what he called a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The most remarkable aspect of Herzl's writings from 1896, from our vantage point today, is how utterly unconcerned Herzl was with the natives of Palestine, such as my great-grandfather, such as many other people who lived and worked and belonged to that land, whose land he and the Zionist movement he led sought to acquire to build their fantasy of an exclusively Jewish state in what had always been and what remains a multi-religious land. Herzl knew, though, that there were natives. He understood that there were native people, there were native bodies in Palestine. He also understood that these natives constituted a problem for his fantasy of building a Jewish state. But he did not see Palestinians, of course, as people with significant history or humanity worth seriously considering. But what Herzl could not necessarily foresee, and in fact in his diaries, Herzl, of course, famously wrote that we should spirit the penniless population across. We should try to move the natives out of Palestine. But he didn't say this in the published tract, he wrote this in his diary. So the idea was, yes, there's a problem, we'll deal with that problem, but we're not really going to deal with Palestinians as people with actual history. But even Herzl, I don't think, could foresee just how shockingly the idea of a Jewish state that he dreamed up in Europe, remember, this is Herzl in Europe, in Vienna, not from the region itself. I don't think Herzl ever imagined, maybe he did, those who are Herzl scholars can tell me if I'm wrong, I don't think he could ever imagine the idea of a Jewish state or what this idea of a Jewish state would ultimately become in Palestine because of the history that transpired over the next century. The idea that this Jewish state would subjugate millions of, quote, non-Jews who live under its draconian rule, whether in the West Bank, whether, of course, in Gaza, being subjected to genocide, whether in East Jerusalem, where they're not citizens, but they're sort of residents, whether around the region subject to relentless bombardment. Because Herzl, when he did speak about non-Jews, he spoke about them sort of condescendingly, but in passing. You know, I don't think he anticipated the idea of a reality that we see today, of a state that is shamelessly brutalizing a population, a state that is committed openly and explicitly to ethno-religious supremacy in a multi-religious land, a state still bound, in fact, to Herzl's 19th century ideology, but with all the force and availability of 21st century technological and military means. In other words, a state that is insisting on its own anachronism and perpetuating this anachronism. For decades now, Herzl's fantasy of an exclusively Jewish state has been involved in shocking pogroms. We've all seen these things in the West Bank. We've seen how this same state has overseen apartheid and segregation, not just in the West Bank, but also in Jerusalem, and also inside Israel itself. We've seen how the state of Israel has created a regime of systematic discrimination that would make any American, or Canadian for that matter, raised after the victory of civil rights in the United States, blush. This apartheid reality has been so thoroughly documented. The archive is so intense, so rich, so obvious. Every single major human rights organization has already published, long before October 7th, whether it's Amnesty, whether it's Human Rights Watch, whether it's the Israeli B'Tselem, whether it's Palestinian human rights organizations, they've all charted, documented this extraordinary reality in the 21st century. The obvious reality is that long before October 7th, there was, of course, October 6th. And there was October 5th and 4th, going all the way back to 1948, and before that 1917, and before that 1897, when European Jewish Zionist nationalists inspired by Herzl met in Basel to put Herzl's vision of a Jewish state in motion, and slowly built up Western support for the idea of an exclusively Jewish state, even when they knew that there were people who lived on the ground like my great-grandfather, Shukri Musa. I want, therefore, not simply to draw your attention to what is being denied, because that's the obvious and the easy part. Yes, there's an obvious, extraordinary denial of the genocide. We can see how it operates. We can see how Palestinians and Lebanese and Arabs and others are removed from view, not talked about. That is the obvious part, at least to me. I mean, by now it should be obvious to everybody. But we should also note what is substituted in its place, what is actually talked about, how one narrative of actual Palestinian history has been consistently and utterly submerged by another Eurocentric, in other words, centering Europe, philo-Zionist, in other words, identifying with Zionism, a narrative that constantly forces the Palestinians not only into being, not so much being a people without history, but being a people scripted into a very particular European history. That is to say, the Palestinians have become today, as Edward Said mentioned decades ago, the anti-Semitic persecutor of the Jews, and at worst, as we often hear on our campuses and across the West, the new Nazis. My other point is to underscore the ethical and political consequences of this substitution, because once we understand not just the way Palestinians are orientalized or erased, but how their history is then replaced with a different Eurocentric Zionist history that has no place for their actuality as human beings with history and society and humanity and passion and love and everything that Palestinians have, once we understand that, we can then understand perhaps the fury and the self-righteousness of liberal Western outrage, and not just liberal, at Palestinian violence that's always coded as barbarism. There's that word again that Herzl used in 1896, and terrorism, and then the Western justification for extraordinary brutality, violence, and genocide that's playing out before our eyes. So it's not just that there is a refusal to acknowledge what's going on, it's that there's actually a willing justification of this genocide in the name of protecting a legacy of the West. It may explain why advocates or activists for Palestinian humanity, and I'm sure at this university like mine as well, so often find themselves voices in a Western liberal wilderness, and why they are so often framed as anti-Semites, even as a stateless, brutalized, and persecuted people are being obliterated before our eyes. What I hope to understand, and to help you understand, to the extent possible, at the broadest level, is why so many people across the liberal West continue to obdurately defend colonial Zionism, given the massive amount of documentation that is so readily available to each and every one of us, and that illustrates just how systematically, not accidentally, but systematically cruel, violent, deliberate, and manifestly unjust this ethno-religious nationalist project remains to the indigenous population of the region. What I also hope to understand is why so many of our colleagues continue to apologize for, to justify, and thus enable and in fact help perpetrate the first live-stream genocide of history, when so many of us, or so many of them, have a choice to speak up, to write against, to speak out against genocide. Why do they not do that, and why instead do they become, at best, its mute witnesses, saying there's nothing they can do, or thinking there's nothing they can do, or at worst, willing, enthusiastic scribes and stenographers of this genocide that's unfolding before our eyes? So what explains this question of not being able to see, or in fact seeing what's happening, and then not doing anything about it? Again, the simple answer, of course, is that these latest Western expressions of philo-Zionism, in other words, the identification with Zionism in the West. And the support of Israel's total war, what is obvious, a total war against Palestinians and Lebanese, not just so-called militants, but the entirety of society, has exposed more clearly than ever a ruthless double standard that has always lay and underlay Western philo-Zionism, Western support of Zionism. And the fundamental double standard is this: Jewish and Israeli history and life are cherished as part of an allegedly enlightened and civilized Western world after World War II. Muslim and Christian Palestinian history and life are fundamentally devalued. The double standard, though, has a much longer history. Protestant enthusiasts and theologians in Europe and North America had long fantasized before the 20th century about the idea of the return of Jews to biblical Palestine, what they called the restoration of Jews. But they had no interest in the actually existing diverse population of actual Palestine. In the 19th century, building on this Christian Zionist, to put it in quotation marks, that's the term that scholars use, in the 19th century, the Zionist Jewish nationalist movement, Herzl in other words, that emerged in Eastern and Central Europe among European Ashkenazi Jews, such as Herzl, also sort of came to the fore, but also ignored the native population, at least in most of their public writings. Part of this fact was geography. Again, the most basic and obvious fact. Everyone should know that Zionism does not and did not emerge among the indigenous Jewish communities and peoples of the Middle East. Because there are Jews who are indigenous to the Middle East. There's no question about that. But Zionism did not emerge to answer those questions and their history. Zionism emerged in Europe. Its leaders were not Arab or Eastern or Sephardic Jews, but European Ashkenazi Jews. Herzl, then Chaim Weizmann, then Ben Gurion, then Golda Meir, then Menachem Begin, today Netanyahu, and so on and so forth. Its ethno-religious nationalist ideology was forged not by the pluralism of the Ottoman Empire that I referred to earlier, but of course by the competing racial and ethnic and linguistic nationalisms of Europe. The racial anti-Semitism, in other words, of the West, that was one of the main catalysts of the Zionist movement and of European Jewish nationalism, was of course alien to the rhythms of religious difference and coexistence with all its fluctuations and unevenness and contradictions of the Middle East. In other words, Zionism did not answer Arab or Middle Eastern questions. It answered European questions. And it emerged in Europe, not in the Middle East. This is such a basic, banal fact, but it actually underpins the entirety of the history that follows. Recall as well that the Zionist project developed openly as a colonialist project in an era when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. So while leading Zionists grappled indeed with racial anti-Semitism, Herzl, for example, I mean, nobody can deny that they actually were grappling with the question of anti-Semitism in Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, shared, contributed to, and circulated many of the foundational racist tropes of the 19th century West, that the non-West was manifestly inferior, including non-Western Jews, Eastern Jews in other words, that the lands of the indigenous peoples around the world, and everyone in Canada knows this of course, was largely empty and thus open to colonization, that the removal of native peoples was necessary and in fact a positive good for human progress. These were all the myths or the ideas that circulated in the 19th century and that became an essential part of how the Zionists in Europe thought about colonizing Palestine. Recall Herzl's statement that the Jewish nationalist state that he dreamed of would be, remember his words, a rampart of Europe, of a portion of Europe against Asia. A rampart of a portion of Europe against Asia, which is an extraordinary phrase. Recall as well the notorious Zionist slogan that developed in the late 19th century into the 20th century that had Christian Zionist roots that was adopted by the Jewish nationalist movement, a land without a people for a people without a land. The underlying point here is that both Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated expressly on solving Europe's Jewish question in quotation marks, because again, the Jewish question was not a Middle Eastern, Ottoman, or Arab question. It was a European question. By removing, quote, restoring Jews en masse from the West, from Europe, to Palestine, again, as if Palestinians do not matter, did not exist, and had no history worth grappling with. So this is like the essential part. Once we understand this, everything else that follows sort of makes sense, even if it's totally unjustifiable. This obfuscation about the history of Palestine and a land without a people for a people without a land became ever more dangerous when Zionism moved from being fantasy, because after all, Herzl was fantasizing, I want to create a Jewish state, to an actual colonial project on the ground backed by the greatest power of the day, the British Empire. I'm speaking here, of course, of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which described, of course, infamously the Palestinians, who were the vast majority of the population of Palestine at that time, as merely, quote, non-Jewish communities. And that's the key phrase in the Balfour Declaration, or one of the key phrases, who paled in historical and religious and civilizational significance when compared to what the Balfour Declaration explicitly identified as the more important Jewish people. So you have the Jewish people on the one hand, who have history, who have rights, who have importance, who have ethics, who mean something to Western statesmen like Balfour, and then you have non-Jewish communities, for even the terms themselves are unequal, who have no significance other than the fact that their bodies in the way of fulfilling this Zionist project. And then the British Mandate that was created in post-Ottoman Palestine in the 1920s privileged explicitly in law, in administration, foreign European Jewish Zionists legally, administratively, and politically. Native Muslim and Christian Palestinian bodies, nevertheless, remained a real. And for the Jewish Zionist movement that was intent on creating a national state in Palestine, in a multi-religious land, the native bodies were not just real, they were an extraordinarily, tangibly unwelcome presence. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is that unlike the distant academic Protestant theologians, the clergymen, who were obsessed with biblical prophecies in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, into the 20th century, colonial Zionists were increasingly preoccupied with a far more secular Arab question. So to solve a Jewish question in Europe, the Zionists created an Arab question in Palestine. In other words, what do we do with the native bodies who are there in Palestine and who impede the creation of a Jewish state? As soon as Zionism moves from Christian and Western colonial fantasy to Western colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians inevitably were seen. And this goes back to my point. It's not simply about not seeing people, it's about seeing them and dismissing them. That's, again, part of that helps us understand why even when we see a live stream genocide today, people are not moved. At least those in power are not moved. As such, the Palestinians constituted a real impediment to the successful unfolding of colonial Zionism. And then, as we go into the history in the 1920s and 1930s, the more the Zionist state structure was put into place with British colonial support during the British Mandate over Palestine between 1920 and 1948, the more native anti-colonial resistance it generated. Native resistance in turn compelled Zionist colonists to grapple more seriously with what, again, they refer to as the Arab problem or question. And the vast majority of these people accepted what Vladimir Jabotinsky, who took the Hebrew name Ze'ev, again, remember, our history is in our name and so is theirs. Vladimir, of course, Jabotinsky came from Eastern Europe, from Russia. He wrote in Russian, and he wrote this essay in 1923 called The Iron Wall, in which he basically said, yes, there are natives. The irony is that the Zionists didn't pretend that the Palestinians were not there. They were there. They were natives. They would resist. They have to be crushed. We have to crush them with military force and create an iron wall, which is the term he used to describe the idea that not only do you physically crush them, but you have to psychologically crush them. You have to make sure the Palestinians, the natives in other words, will lose hope of ever resisting our project. Only when they lose hope, then we can come to terms, our terms, with them, when we defeat them. So that's the idea of the Iron Wall. First there are British bayonets, but then there's also going to be Zionist bayonets as well. And you have to crush the Palestinians, the native population, not just physically, but mentally as well. You have to make them give up. And so what happened, of course, over the course of the 1920s and 1930s is that as the Palestinians marched, and the irony is that people who ask for nonviolence, the Palestinians protested, they marched, they petitioned, they spoke, they argued, they published, they organized into various societies and political parties and so on and so forth when these political parties were allowed, which for the most part they weren't. They did everything they could and they were ignored. Then they rioted, or they rioted and they protested, and they did all these things, what any people would do when their land is being colonized. And when they protested and they rebelled, they were called rioters and authors of disturbances, and they were crushed. And when they came up with one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings of the interwar period in 1936 to 1939, they were brutally repressed, just like the Syrians were in 1925 in what was also the two largest anti-colonial uprisings of the interwar period. Smashed, crushed. But the British understood by 1937, that the system in Palestine, the mandate in Palestine was unsustainable. You can't both support a Zionist project and pretend, as the British had done all along, that no harm would come to the, quote, civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities of Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. In other words, there's no way to reconcile Zionism as a political project with the well-being of the native population. Something had to be done. So what did the British do? You all know, I'm sure, the history, and of course, just to say this, in 1937, the Palestinians were still the vast majority of the population, and were still the vast majority of the owners of the land. So the vast majority of land was owned by Palestinians, and the vast majority of the population was still Palestinian. The Zionists were, if you look on the map to the left, my left, you can see in the blue is where the Zionist colonies were mostly focused. And so then the question was how then to create some kind of solution, quote unquote, to this problem that was created not by the Palestinians, but by the British and the Zionists who wanted to create, remember, an exclusively Jewish state in multi-religious Palestine. So what did the British do? They send a commission of white colonial men. This is familiar to the history of Canada and the history of North America, the history of many parts of the world. These men, which became known as the Peel Commission, drew up in 1937 in response to the Palestinian uprising. They drew up the first partition plan of Palestine. It's called the Peel Partition Plan. And the interesting thing about that plan in 1937 is that, first of all, it violated the Balfour Declaration itself in the sense that it clearly violates the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. And it violates what the British had been telling the Palestinians for 20 years, from 1917 to 1937. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. We have your interests at heart. Zionism is not about creating a Jewish state. And then lo and behold, in 1937, they said, well, there is going to be a Jewish state. What's more interesting is that both the Peel Commission of 37 and then the UN Partition Plan of 1947, the UN Partition Plan of Palestine, both privileged the making of a Jewish state. That is what they wanted to create. Not the question of how to divide Palestine. It's about how to create a Jewish state and at the same time make it a viable state. So the interest was not to create a secular or democratic state, but actually how to create a Jewish state. And the central part of that was, of course, the dispossession of the native Palestinian majority of much of its land and homes to make way for the Jewish state. In other words, the idea was that a Jewish state was inevitable and necessary and important and ethical, and therefore the Palestinians, again, as a secondary group, would have to give up their homes and lands. Now note what the British said in 1937. In the Partition Plan of 37, the Peel Partition Plan of 1937, the plan was extremely brutal. The Jewish state, which in the north, in the fertile lands, again, where most of the Jewish colonies, the Zionist colonies, were located, that would be given over to a Jewish state. The Palestinian population would be removed. Irrespective of how long they've been in this land, they'll be removed. The Peel Partition Plan authors, again, all British colonial white men, all said and explicitly acknowledged insofar as we need Western acknowledgement. But they said, anti-Semitism does not come from this part of the world. They also said there was no history of an Arab-Jewish conflict until the British arrived. They also said the Arab natives are the vast majority of the land of Palestine. But then the Peel Commissioners also said, with remarkable disingenuity or disingenuousness, they said that proverbial Arab generosity, the Arabs are a generous people, and they're going to help resolve our Jewish question, the West's Jewish question, at some, quote, sacrifice to themselves. They're going to help solve the Jewish problem of Europe. In other words, you're a generous people, you're going to help us resolve our problem by giving up your lands and homes. It's not fair. We know, we recognize it's not fair, but you're helping us and you're going to earn the gratitude, not just of the Jewish people, but of the entire Western world, the so-called civilized world. That is explicitly, and you can look this up, you can find this on Internet Archive, it's all available. Go read the whole 400-page Peel plan and see for yourself what they say. It is extraordinary. This is the public document. There's a private section as well. Right away in 1938, as soon as the Peel Commission was published, an Arab, Palestinian, Lebanese scholar by the name of George Antonius wrote a famous book called The Arab Awakening, in which he specifically wrote the book to dismiss and dispel and dispute the Peel Commission's findings. And Antonius, who of course was native to this region, realized just how violent this Peel Commission, how unjust this Peel Commission partition plan was. You're partitioning somebody else's land and creating a Jewish state at the expense of the non-Jewish population, who are going to be removed forcibly from their homes and lands to make way for a Jewish state. And Antonius wrote at the end of this book, 1938, so before Kristallnacht, obviously after the Nazis had come to power, before Kristallnacht, obviously before the Holocaust as well. He wrote, "The treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other European countries is a disgrace to its authors and to modern civilization. But posterity will not exonerate any country that fails to bear its proper share of sacrifices needed to alleviate Jewish suffering and distress. To place the brunt of the burden upon Arab Palestine is a miserable evasion of the duty that lies upon the whole of the civilized world. It is also morally outrageous." There is no code of conduct, if you truly believe in equality of people, that says you resolve European anti-Semitism at the expense of the Palestinians. Now, Antonius wrote this again in 1938. Again, you can find this book, just like the Peel Commission, on the Internet Archive, and I encourage everyone to go read this book. Antonius, of course, was not privy to the secret testimonies and to the writings that the Peel Commissioners themselves documented. And again, in fact, a scholar here, Leila Parsons and McGill, has written about this. And you can go find out what they said and what they wrote about the Palestinians in secret. And you can also go find out the secret evidence that the Peel Commissioners accepted in Jerusalem in 1938, as well as in London. Among them was Winston Churchill, who, of course, always celebrated in the West as the great sort of, leader and all that stuff. But this is what Winston Churchill told the Peel Commissioners infamously. He said, of course, he's comparing Palestinians to a dog in the manger. And he said, "I do not agree that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." Explicit. So you have, on the one hand, the public Peel, Arabs are generous, they're going to help us solve our problem, and then you have the more sort of frank racist assessment, the brutal racist assessment of Churchill. Neither the liberal Peel, sort of in the presentation, nor Churchill in his racism, neither one denied that the Palestinians were there and were going to suffer and were to give up their lands. There was complete awareness, in other words, of what was happening. It's not that they didn't see, it's that they saw and they justified. So, at the same time, of course, as all that is happening, it's important to sort of note that the US politicians after World War II, after the Holocaust, rejected allowing, of course, survivors of the Holocaust en masse into the United States because of US racist immigration laws, just as Arthur Balfour of the Balfour Declaration had turned down the idea and rejected the idea of mass Eastern European Jewish immigration into England. But these same US politicians and journalists and intellectuals across the US who refused to open up the US to support Jewish refugees and survivors of the Holocaust were completely okay with the sending of hundreds of thousands of European Jewish survivors to Palestine, which is, of course, what the Zionist movement wanted, in the name of, quote, decency and humanitarianism. Precisely as Antonius had feared, native Palestinians were entirely shut out of the decision-making process that directly affected them. And in November 1947, the Western-dominated UN partitioned Palestine into two states to establish again a Jewish state. That was what the Western powers wanted. Despite the fact, again, as late as 1947, the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine was Palestinian, despite centuries of Palestinian belonging on what had always been their land, their villages, their towns, their homes, their memories, all of which were stripped away in this infamous partition plan, which gave the Jewish minority a majority of Palestine. Again, the rest is history, so to speak. And I want to sort of summarize the rest for reasons of time. The Nakba, the calamity of 1948, followed directly from this partition plan and brutally resolved the problem of majority of Palestinian bodies that were seen as an impediment to the creation of a Jewish state that it's for so long preoccupied colonial Zionists. Before, during, and after the War of 1948, the Zionist forces expelled approximately 900,000 Palestinians to neighboring lands, expropriated their homes, lands, books, properties, archives. My mother's relatives lost their home in Jerusalem. This was the moment when what we today call the Gaza Strip, of course, the mangled geography of the Gaza Strip, which never existed historically. There was Gaza, but there wasn't a Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a function of the Nakba of 1948, amputated from the rest of Palestine. Now, liberal Western leaders, note, philosophers, theologians, hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist state, Jewish state, in historically multi-religious Palestine. They did so, such as Niebuhr, such as the author or one of the co-authors of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt. They did so by rationalizing the idea that the creation of a Jewish state trumped the suffering of Palestinians, plus the natives themselves and the Arabs more generally were irrational, primitive, and aggressive because they opposed what Western philosophers and politicians thought of as a fundamentally decent and good thing, the creation of a Jewish state in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And so what happened then over the course of the next 60, 70 years is more than simply Western settler colonialism and the practice of native elimination. The support of Israel, the identification with Israel, reflected the reconstitution of a post-war, post-World War II Western humanism. A humanism, in quotation marks, born with a philo-Zionist core. This, I think, is crucial for us to understand and appreciate. And my former colleague at Rice University, a historian by the name of Daniel Cohen, has a forthcoming book called Philo-Semitism in Europe Since the Holocaust, in which, in painstaking detail, Cohen shows how in the wake of World War II, the European philosophical, religious, and moral rehabilitation of man, white, Western man, of course, was predicated on the recognition of the history of anti-Semitism that had culminated with the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust, but not with a recognition or a similar sort of atoning for the history of Western colonialism. In other words, there was a separation of the two. Anti-Semitism as something that had to be dealt with by the West, racism and colonialism as something that wasn't dealt with at the same time. This bifurcation is what Aimé Césaire, the famous poet and author of Negritude, castigated as Western pseudo-humanism. You know, in 1955, when Césaire was pointed out, he said, you can't separate these things. These are part and parcel of the same problem, racism and anti-Semitism, colonialism and Nazism. They belong together, conceptually, philosophically, and to separate them out leads us to precisely the kinds of post-war Western liberal, quote, atonement of anti-Semitism, but no atonement of colonialism, and worse, in the case of Palestine, alleged atonement for the question of Nazism and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism at the expense of non-Western people. That's what Césaire, in a sense, was alluding to. He wasn't talking about Palestinians directly, he was talking about Algeria, Madagascar, Haiti, Africa, the Caribbean, Vietnam, and other indigenous peoples around the world. But I think it's really important to understand how the splitting of the fight against anti-Semitism on the one hand, which the post-war West now deplored, from the fight against racism and colonialism more broadly, which the post-war West continued to uphold with extraordinary tenacity after World War II. So that the end result is that in the philo-Semitic Western humanism, one could love Israel and love Jews allegedly, and still hate Arabs and blacks. One could now largely love the absent Jews of Europe and love them instead in their new, and in the eyes of Western philo-Zionists, proper home in Israel. Palestinians be damned. This is at the core of so much of how it is that the question of Israel gets separated out and the Palestinians get removed, in Western humanist imagination from the question of colonialism, and simply put in the question of anti-Semitism, which of course means returning us to Europe and an extraordinarily Eurocentric story that culminates with the Holocaust. So there's a consistent denial of the Palestinian relationship to Palestine, and this has had profound, and a substitution of Palestinian history with a different narrative that's had profoundly corrosive moral, political, and ethical effects. And there are various dogmas which continue until now. And I'll end with these last few words. The first of the dogmas is that in the liberal West, in power especially, and those who aspire to power, you cannot dare question Israel as a Jewish state, no matter what such a state does or implies to the millions of native Muslim and Christian Palestinian survivors of the Nakba, who remain condemned at best to be precarious second-class citizens, that is to say the 20% who are citizens of Israel, let alone the subjects of military apartheid and brutality and occupation across Palestine, let alone the millions who are outside in exile. So there's that point. You can't question that, no matter this whole history, because if you question that, and you question colonial Zionism, you end up questioning the West's alleged turn on its own anti-Semitic past. So that's the first dogma. The second dogma, philo-Zionist dogma, is that Israel is seen, of course, as an extension of an idealized West. Classical music, European institutions, a modern army, allegedly pioneers, communal kibbutzes, and a young nation, allegedly, that's contrasted constantly with the idea of Arab refugees, nameless, squalid, and ultimately sort of you can't relate to them. So Israel is what the West wanted and needed after World War II, an emancipated part of its part of itself allegedly purged of historical anti-Semitism. And that's why in the 1950s and 1960s, so many in the left supported the Israeli Zionist project. Again, trade unions, liberal theologians, radicals, socialists, liberals, they all supported this Zionist state. The third dogma, and this is what changes from the earlier history to where we are, is that the Palestinians as people become increasingly not just invisible in a sense of they have no history, but unrelatable to Western humanism, except, as Edward Said said, as a negative value. And so the Palestinians are not just represented as sullen refugees, dehistoricized, or when they're not just dehistoricized refugees, when they try to fight back, when they start mobilizing themselves in exile in the 1960s and 70s, they become, of course, enraged and violent people who violate the core of Western humanism because they oppose colonial Zionism. Because in the Western imagination, Israel is the atonement for Western anti-Semitism. Therefore, if you oppose Israel, you oppose fighting anti-Semitism. Therefore, you are an anti-Semite. Therefore, you represent the antithesis of what the West claims to be after World War II. And so there you have this history. Now I can go on endlessly and talk so much more, and I wanted to talk more, but I'll stop here, about how all this then helps understand the furious self-righteous morality after October 7th, Because what's so stunning about this, again, is that when Israeli leaders are explicit and say things that are so shocking, like Palestinians are human animals, and you go follow Israeli social media and see what they say about Palestinians, it's an unfiltered 19th century discourse about natives. It's absolutely unfiltered. Yet despite that unfiltered discourse, the support in the West continues. So that Trudeau, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Simon Schama in terms of the historians, Benny Morris, they all sort of refuse to acknowledge the history that I've been talking about. They actually represent it. They embody it, but they don't actually understand it or engage with it. And they still, therefore, think of themselves, as Benny Morris says, yes, infamously in 2004, Benny Morris, the racist Israeli historian, who famously or infamously said, again, openly, in an interview, something that no other historian, I think, could possibly say. He says, yes, we're oppressing the Palestinians. I'm paraphrasing. Go look up the interview in Haaretz, 2004. Yes, we're oppressing the Palestinians, but we are the greater potential victim here. Which summarizes exactly what I'm trying to say, that there's a history, a profound history that they see of themselves and of their history that is vastly more consequential to whatever happens to the Palestinians. And so, here we are, 60 years after the abolition, if I'm not mistaken, the abolition of Jim Crow in the US South, over 30 years after the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, long after the land acknowledgements in Canada and other places, Israel still celebrates openly a 19th century ideology, but uses 21st century means to sort of enact and sustain this ideology. And then this is where we are. So I end here by saying that the students, and this is addressed to the students here, the students in particular who have not, for whatever reason, and this is worth thinking about, who have not been indoctrinated in the same way into this sort of liberal language and this narrative that I've drawn out, and who have in fact through social media and through whatever networks that they have been seeing images of Gaza and out of Gaza, and have been sort of in their own minds doing something that's so natural and human, empathizing with people who are actually suffering, that they can see suffering, and are not overlaying that and overwriting that suffering with a completely ideological narrative, are outraged. And the students represent the future. Everyone who's trying to suppress the students represents this past that I've been trying to talk about, this 20th century Eurocentric past. And that's where we are today, honestly. There's a vast amount of censorship, a vast amount of repression that is completely different from the way the West used to have the Zionist movement in the 50s and 60s, when there wasn't repression. There was, in fact, confidence. There was an unchallenged narrative based on this ideology, based on this philo-Zionism. That's all changed right now, which is why there's such extraordinary repression that's so explicit, that tells every single student here and on my campus and every other campus, don't you dare protest on behalf of Palestine, because you will be punished. But that, of course, is precisely what every student of every generation has been told whenever students have fought against injustice throughout time. And the crucible of Gaza, more than any previous moment in history, of all the tribulations of the Palestinians, exposes, to my mind at least, a damning evidence of the moral and political failure, not just of colonial Zionism, that's obvious, on the ground, that can no longer be obfuscated, hard as its apologists may try. More fundamentally, it exposes the narcissism, the denialism, the racism of the secular and religious supporters of Zionism in the West. For unlike the era of the Nakba of 1948, when the Palestinian bodies were removed from Palestine, but we didn't have the media we have today. Today we can all see, we go back to those images I showed at the beginning, we can all see what's happened to the Palestinians, the bodies. We can all see the mutilated, broken, terrorized, traumatized bodies of Palestinians and Lebanese in full view. The reality is that as much as they might wish to have one, Israelis and their supporters in the West do not have a military option, solution, no matter how many Palestinians they kill in Gaza or in Lebanon or in the West Bank or in Jerusalem or anywhere else in the region. It's so clear, once you know some history, that racism, apartheid, the weaponization of charges of anti-Semitism will not succeed in making Palestinians disappear as people, nor stop them or their allies around the world of all faiths, including, of course, Jewish anti-Zionists, from fighting and advocating for liberation. But until that future is achieved, each of us has a fundamental choice to make. Each of us has to decide on which side of history we want to stand, whether we want to be for or against real justice, for and against real freedom, for or against real equality and real love for people of all faiths between the river and the sea. And that's the choice we all have, and I end with that. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. We have the room until 6 o'clock. So please, if you have questions for Professor Makdisi, you have a microphone on the desk. You can use that in order to be audible. Just press the button as soon as it turns red, you're live. And given especially the way that Professor Makdisi ended his talk, it might be good if students in the audience have questions, we might prioritize some of those.
Don't be shy, you get an A. Do you have A's here?
Over there in the back.
Oh. Is there a student? I don't know if there's a student.
There is a student.
There's students there somewhere, I don't know. So go ahead, ask, wherever you are. I think you need it for the. Oh, they're not working.
Okay, so they say that colonialism.
I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
They say that colonialism in the end puts everybody involved, even the perpetuators. Do you think that in the end, what Israel's doing to Gaza right now will fight back Israel in the West, and if so, how?
So the question is, it is said, right, that's the question. It is said that colonialism, or settler, I can't remember, did you say settler colonialism or colonialism ends up affecting and hurting and harming the perpetrators or the colonists as much as the colonized, correct? Isn't that the question?
To some extent.
Okay, to some extent. And so, yeah, the answer is yes, obviously not to the same degree, not to the same immediacy. I mean, there's no comparison in terms of what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank or to what's happening to Israelis. But there's no question that there is going to be massive effects, obviously. And there have been massive effects because this is what even Israelis, even the most right-wing Israelis, like my brother said, he has a book called Palestine, which I've learned a lot from, and used Palestine and the Culture of Denial. It's called Tolerance as a Wasteland. He quotes an Israeli geographer and demographer by the name of Arnon Sofer, who actually, came up with this whole idea, if I remember correctly, about sort of punishing Gaza and keeping Gaza under siege, long before, when we're talking about decades ago. And his main concern, he said, is I don't care what happens, I'm paraphrasing, I don't care what happens to Palestinians. He said, I care what happens to the Jewish soldiers who have to go serve, the Israeli soldiers have to go serve and enforce this blockade, because what's going to happen when they come back home? And that's the negative. In other words, that's the violent extremist who's coming up with a whole plan to persecute the Palestinians. They're aware of the costs. Then, of course, you have much earlier, going back to the 1920s, to answer your question in a different way, in a more positive way. There were, of course, there were some Zionists in Palestine, in mandatory Palestine, that I wrote about in my last book. One by the name of Hans Kohn, who was an Austrian, like Herzl himself. He was Austrian. He was Jewish, he was a famous historian, he moved to Palestine, became a Zionist, moved to Palestine, and then in 1929, after the Burak uprising, he quit Zionism. And the reason he said is that he said, we've been here for 10 years, he said, in Palestine, and we've never once tried to deal with the Palestinians, he called them Arabs, but the Arabs, the Palestinians, on this land in an equitable manner. And he said, the way we treat Palestinians, the way we deal with the Arab question, is the litmus, is the touchstone of what's going to happen to our humanity, in a sense, our ethics. And that's how, and so he said, because of that, you have to, because he saw it as a corrupting enterprise, Zionism, and therefore he quit Zionism. He said Zionism is not Judaism. So do you see what I'm saying? So yes, at that level, of course, there's an effect. There's an effect when one has to, and you can see this on campuses throughout, when you meet people who are, perfectly decent people in most walks of life, but when it comes to Palestine, suddenly they become unable to articulate the most basic and obvious point, which is that what's happening is unconscionable and unacceptable, period. Do you see what I'm saying? And so when you get to that point, you're obviously affecting, I'm not talking about Israelis, I'm talking about people here who may support Israel, where they can't even, they're in crisis oftentimes when they're confronted with all these facts, because most of them don't know these facts. And when they're confronted with these facts, they don't know what to say. And so that creates its own tension. And then, of course, there's the whole question of Israel being a Jewish state, and giving security, but look what's happening inside. You cannot be in perpetual warfare with an indigenous population, which is today, remember, in Palestine itself, historic Palestine, the state of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, 7 million, this is despite the genocide, 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Israeli Jews. And then when you widen the scope to the region, you have 500 million Arabs who have seen, witnessed, just like everyone else here, but with much more media and Arabic access. They have seen the Nakba, or the genocide, unfold in the most extraordinary manner. And there is a sense of, just like we're hurt and we're grieved, they're also hurt and grieving. That can't bode well. That's where we are. And when you have an Israeli fascist party like Ben Gvir and Netanyahu and Smotrich and these people who represent now and run the state of Israel, that tells you its own story. You see what I'm saying? So yes, absolutely.
There's a question way in the back. Yes, you standing. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear you. Can you just?
I think you have to stop pushing on your red button.
Go ahead. Try that.
Okay. So yeah, I was saying that I found your explanation of a secular Arab question in the 20th century really interesting, as something that in and of itself reveals the contradictions of Israel as like this parliamentary democratic state. So I was wondering if you could recontextualize that in like the 21st century, like right now, potentially as an opportunity that can be used to reclaim this idea of an Arab secular question, something that can be used to redefine a political identity that has otherwise been imposed on this population. If that makes sense.
Well, this is now gone.
Now you have to do that one.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So if I'm not entirely sure I understood the question. I'm sorry, but are you asking about what can be done to salvage or to rethink a secular Arab? Is that the question? A secular Arab identity today? Just to understand the question, because I'm not sure I understood the question. Okay. So if that's secular identity. I mean, there's a whole it's an excellent question. It's a very difficult question to answer, except to say the thing about secular is not to think of secular as the opposite of Jewish or Arab or Palestinian or whatever, but to think of secular as a human choice that people make. It's an affiliation people make. In other words, that each of us were born in the way we're born. We don't have any control of where we're born or who we're born to, but ultimately we do have a secular affiliation that we, and this of course is again going back to Edward Said, we do have these choices that we make through education, through learning, about making a certain kind of choice, a secular affiliation as opposed to the affiliation into which we're born. So in terms of Arab, again, because I'm not entirely sure about the question, in terms of Arab identity, yes, there is a question of a secular future for Palestine. I think it's really important to understand that there's a difference between resistance, which is where we are today, and obliteration. There's a genocide, there's resistance, but resistance itself is not the same thing as liberation. The real question for me when we think forward to the future is, what does liberation mean? What does it include? And I'm not a politician to sort of tell you what it's going to be, but I think it's essential to understand that any future of this region that includes millions of Jews and millions of Palestinians has to be based on some kind of formula that is based on secular equality. Beyond that, everything else is simply I feel unfeasible. And that's why I think those who advocate for a two-state solution, especially liberal Zionists who advocate for a two-state solution, what they're doing is that they're simply postponing reckoning with the fact that one of those two states that they claim to care about is still a supremacist state. And they talk about a two-state solution, by which they mean they want to maintain a Jewish state irrespective of what that means for the 20% of the population that is Palestinian. You see what I'm saying? And so these things have to be confronted and dealt with and acknowledged and argued about, especially this idea of a future that can actually fundamentally hold equality for both, for people of all faiths in what has always been a multi-religious land.
Question here.
How can we address the continued instrumentalization of Jewish Zionist fear as a weapon against pro-Palestine activism and speech, on campus specifically?
I mean, the way to do that, first of all, there are Jewish students who are anti-Zionist, and they play obviously a crucial role in the solidarity movement. Again, this goes back to the first question that was asked, in part because they recognize that their Jewish ethics, their Jewish history, their sense of Jewishness is completely bound up with the question of Palestinian ethics and liberation and future. So they see a joint future. And in that sense, I think it's crucial, it's absolutely crucial to push back, to not allow the framing of fear and anxiety as something that is, you can acknowledge fear. As a professor, I always acknowledge, you can acknowledge people's fears. You can acknowledge, and one should acknowledge fears and anxiety. But fears and anxiety are not the same thing as argument, nor are they the same thing as a presentation of historical fact, nor are they the same thing as a presentation of a future. And so one can acknowledge fear, but without succumbing to that fear. I think that's very basic, honestly. And of course, the fear works both ways. It's not just the fear of certain Zionists and the weaponization of that fear by various organizations to stifle conversation. That's what's happening on our campuses. But also, one should acknowledge fear, but also stay absolutely firm in the principles that we all believe in. I mean, otherwise there's no point doing what we do, I feel. But under no circumstances allow this question of fear to stifle intellectual, that's what we are ultimately, intellectuals, intellectual engagement and argument for something that we passionately believe in. My job is not to make students, in a sense, or none of our jobs are not to, our jobs are to educate students. Our job is not to say that all your preconceived notions are going to remain intact after you come into contact with facts.
Thank you for your talk. I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
I took the question that you asked in your talk to be, how is it that it is possible in 2024 that a live-streamed genocide is not just possible, but can continue relatively, not to say unopposed, but how is it possible that it can continue with the support of such a great extent of Western media, politicians, elites, and populations as well. And I took your answer to be that in order to understand that support, we have to go back to the 19th century and to the early 20th century. And we have to understand both the history of European anti-Semitism and the way in which Zionism was both presented and politically became a response to the Jewish question in Europe and to the continuation of European anti-Semitism. And that therefore we have to understand Philo-Zionism as a key part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very sympathetic and in agreement with that analysis, but I was surprised then that you ended on a optimistic note. That sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
but that in fact you said, given this analysis, and given that you might say that over the past 70 years we are at the worst point in terms of the violence, in terms of the openness of the violence, in terms of what is possible and what can be the massacres, the crimes that can be committed on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I'm therefore surprised if the sources of this openness, of this possibility, go back to the late 19th and early 20th century, and to the Holocaust, and to the way in which Zionism becomes that answer. If this genocide hasn't shifted that, if it hasn't disrupted that logic, then I am at a loss to see where the optimism is coming from, that settler colonialism and colonialism isn't going to just stay.
So that's an excellent question, and I think maybe I was not clear. Because this was supposed to be a 40-minute talk, it ended up being an hour, so I apologize to everybody here. I don't know what happened. Usually I'm very good with time, but maybe I got carried away. So in terms of optimism, I have two answers. One is, alas, I come from the United States. They always tell you end with an optimistic note. The serious answer to it's a serious question. The serious answer to a serious question is that what you see right now is that the logic of Philo-Zionism that was predicated on the devaluation of not just Palestinian life, but the overriding of that life with this other narrative is being challenged. I think in fact it is being challenged. And that's precisely why we see this mass repression that was not on our campuses in the 1970s or 80s or 90s, or in the question of Palestine. In fact, when there were Palestinian demonstrators in the 70s and 80s, there would be maybe 5, 10, 20 people max. And there were almost always Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims. Almost never the coalitions that we see today. So something has shifted. And in part, the shift is taking place because the anachronism, precisely this anachronism, that has enabled Zionism for so long, is in fact becoming untenable. So the violence that you see, what you're talking about, the violence, yes, the violence is unprecedented. But that, you could argue that in one of two ways. Either it is as the right wing thinks it is in Israel and in America, and the liberal class in America that supports Zionism, just be done with the Palestinians once and for all. Let's resolve, this is our opportunity to resolve the Palestine question once and for all, and let's take this moment and push the Palestinians out of Gaza, then push them out of the West Bank, and we'll be done with the Palestine question forever, which is what I think the thinking, honestly, I think of not just Netanyahu and the gang around him, but also the US policymakers like Brett McGurk and Blinken and these. I think that is exactly what they are thinking. That they wanted to take the opportunity of the Gaza genocide to push the Palestinians out to Egypt, be done with the Palestine question in their minds. But that to me, when I think about it in historical terms, I look at the populations, look at the demographics between 48 and where we are today. So despite Israel's massive, overwhelming support with this, not just because of this, it's not just the narrative, it's a material also question, military, material, economic question, but also a cultural question. Despite the vast, overwhelming US Western support for the Zionist project, the population of Palestinians has increased inexorably, inside historic Palestine as well as outside. Outside, you could see it manifested across the West and across the world. There are so many more Palestinians now who are literate, who are educated, who then make friends, and then, do you see what I'm saying? There's a whole network that's being built. It's a generational work. Inside of Palestine, you have 50% of the population, so it's a far larger percentage than was the case in 48. You have more resistance than ever before. Hence, you have more brutality than ever before. But the Israeli wagers that the genocide and the brutality is going to achieve a political solution. My sense, just knowing the demographics, is that it's not going to achieve a political solution. In fact, what's going to happen is that this goes back to that question that was asked at the beginning. The crisis in Israel is going to perpetuate. There's not going to be any security. This idea, this myth that you can create a stable state in a region and have sort of Silicon Valley on the Mediterranean and all that stuff with misery and people who are so enraged and committed to resistance will never work. Something has to change. And so my optimism is not in any way to deny the horrors of what we're seeing today, nor to deny the history that I've been trying to talk about, but to say that history itself is predicated on a certain narrative that has been challenged and that is being challenged. Whether it will be successfully challenged or not, we shall see. But I think it is going to be challenged precisely because if you look at, again, the shifts that are taking place at a generational level. I see this at Berkeley. I'm sure you see this at McGill. I hope you see this at McGill. If these are indicators of something, that there's a massive generation shift. It's not just our students who are, putting their bodies on the line in camping, doing all the things that they're doing, but it's also, look at the faculty, look at the non-tenure track, in other words, the precarious faculty, look at all the staff, look at the generational shift. It's incredibly noticeable. The younger you are, the more open to Palestine one is. It's an extraordinary thing that you see. These will have consequences. So I think Ilan Pappé, the Israeli historian, says it's true. This is the most brutal phase of Zionism. And let's see, in the end, if we're wrong, we're wrong. But my optimism comes from the fact that there is a generation shift taking place. Israel ultimately, and this war, this genocide, proves that Israel depends 1,000,000% on the US. It could not fight one day, I'm convinced, without US support. And US support is predicated entirely on an ideological edifice that I've been talking about. And that edifice is being challenged. The question is, will it be challenged enough? I don't know. But I'm confident that it will be. That's the only thing I'll say, without pretending to know what's going to happen, because I don't know.
We have 3, 4, 5 questions. A lot of people have their hands up now. We will start here, and then in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for such a historically illuminating talk. So moving on from the questions we've had, there's historically speaking, as you said, whenever there has been protest against historical injustice, there is repression. Now, I want to draw attention to the BDS movement on the question of Palestine. And when students across universities were demanding divestment and boycott, even academically, historically they were like, we have had cases where we've had success. The South African apartheid was a big case. So my question here is what is special about the case of Palestine that despite the kind of widespread protests by students all over the West, that it has failed to generate support politically when we've had historical examples of successfully fighting historical injustice? And the other question I have is that there have been Israeli scholars in the West who are drawing attention to the fact that the other problem is that the people of Israel today support this kind of genocide. And so historically, how can we explain and is there a difference from what you know between the older Israeli people or the younger generation who reside in Israel who might ever see why is this wrong? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So very briefly, first of all, on the question of student protest, right, and BDS, and why there has been so little support. That's the question, right, in the West. Remember that the question of apartheid was also one of generational struggles. So it's not that and by apartheid I don't just mean the form of apartheid as in South Africa after 1948. I mean the whole idea of supremacy in South Africa. and the black struggle for liberation, both in Africa and in South Africa, but also in the US, was a very long, protracted, uneven struggle. So it's not like it just happened overnight, and it's not like it happened without tremendous resistance. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. But you're right, there are some differences. And I think people who say the South African model we have to learn from the South African model without being bound to the South African model, because there are some fundamental differences. There's no question, given the narrative that I tried to lay out to you, that there is a philo-Zionism, a depth of commitment in Western sort of post-war humanism to this project of Zionism that vastly outweighs the kind of commitment there was to South African apartheid. But that doesn't mean just because of that things are not changing, because you can see things are changing, even among younger Jewish populations. And so the point is, things are changing as people get more exposed to the history. And notice what's happening on our campuses. The Zionists in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s that I was talking about celebrated Israel. It was a celebration of Israel. Pioneers, redeeming the land. That was the discourse. That was the myth, the mantras, that they were like us, etc., 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 right? That's how it was done. What's happened today on our campuses is that it's no longer about the celebration of Israel. It's all about we are anti-Semites. In other words, they don't even intellectually defend what Israel, because it's indefensible, and they understand it. They don't defend Israel because every human rights organization has said very clearly this is an apartheid state. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates writes his book, The Message, and is attacked on television, and on television, I don't mean television, I mean whatever, social media, and interviews, and he stands his ground and says, no, this is apartheid. There's no argument. They don't have an argument anymore. They have, as Sadi, again, to quote my brother, he's my older brother, so I'm allowed to quote him, as he says, they've gone to war against argument itself, and so what they're trying to do is shut everything down. Shut everything down, because they don't actually have an intellectual, ethical, or moral argument to make. That's why they emphasize anti-Semitism all the time on campuses. Precisely because they can't make a positive argument, they have to make the negative argument. That's a shift, again. So BDS has not worked. It doesn't mean BDS won't work. It just means that this is a question of it's generational work. And remember that the students who have been protesting now are not coming out of nothing. They're coming out of history. There were students before, and people before have been struggling for generations for the same object. But in your time, now, there is far more coalition building possible, a different kind of imagination. There are also different kinds of enemies. And what we have in the US, I don't know what Canada is like, in the US you have a pincer movement. So on the one hand you have a generational change that's so obvious and clear, and you have coalition building of students of all faiths, all backgrounds, Jewish, Black, Palestinian, Muslim, etc., Christian, all these people, Hindu, Buddhist, secular, atheists, whatever, they're all coming in places like California, but also across the US, and I'm sure in Canada as well. That's one phenomenon. The other phenomenon is at the institutional level, what you have is again, Canada may be different, so you will explain to me, but in the US it's so clear. In the democratic states, you have liberal Zionists who are leading this kind of censorship of, and Democratic Party establishment leading the censorship of campuses in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. And in the right-wing Republican states, what you have is an anti-critical, anti-black, anti-migrant, anti-everything, as far as I can see, movement to crush. And they merge on Israel. That's the one point where they actually agree. And so, yeah, there is a battle. And it's not going to be easy. But, that's the nature of every single political struggle. There hasn't been a single political struggle in history without these kinds of movements. And each has its specificity. But it's a great question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk. I wanted to go back to the question about how to explain the intractable support of the U.S. for Israel and the West more generally, Western governments more generally. And I mean, I really appreciate your reflection and your commentary on the role of atonement in that. But I'd appreciate hearing your reflections on the relationship between that kind of explanation and other kinds of explanations, like Western geopolitical interests in the region, the politics of oil, declining American power in the world vis-a-vis other superpowers, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, because I'm struggling also with how to explain how impervious Western governments are, with the interesting exception of France, it seems. You know, how impervious those governments are to all kinds of argument and evidence and pressure and etc. How to explain that. And so I'm wondering if you would see those other kinds of explanations as simply conjunctural, you know, like they're of this moment, and an explanation like the one you offered is a longer term historical one and therefore has more weight in a certain way. So if we're trying to think about how to crack it, what's your reflection on that?
So that's I mean, honestly, it's a fantastic question, and it's also it's a very difficult question to answer. But because I think of them in terms of, I don't think of either or. I focused on the question. I wouldn't even call it atonement. I would call it atonement in quotation marks, alleged atonement, because there's no such thing in my view of atonement at the expense of others. There's just that's not atonement. That's something else. But yes, your point is well taken. The question about geopolitics, oil, for example. But that raises a fascinating question that historians, and I'm sure you're aware of this, have debated endlessly, especially on the question of Zionism in Israel and the US, since you mentioned the US. And the question was back in 47, around the partition debate. The question was, what does a Jewish state created it in Palestine at the expense, because remember at the time everyone understood this was coming at the expense of the native population, and they also understood that there was a huge amount of opposition in the region to the creation of the state at the expense, because it was coming at the expense of the native population. And of course the US at the time already, in 47, already had strong ties with the Saudi monarchy. In fact, the entirety of the Arab world, the formal Arab world, was pro-Western in one way or another. The Hashemites on the one hand, the Saudis on the other. All the oil resources were under US control or British control. And so the question that was asked is, why and what does the state do for this project do for us? And the interesting thing is that the CIA, the State Department, the Secretary of State George Marshall, George Kennan, the famous Cold Warrior, and all these people said there's no obvious interest. This is a domestic question. It has nothing to do with our geopolitics. So if you just trace the archives and see, it's not about geopolitics in that sense, but it is about a certain kind of interest, a political interest, domestically driven. That was abundantly clear in 47. The question then is, once Israel is created, and once it defeats the Arab states, and once it expels the Palestinians, of course it becomes a fait accompli, and therefore it can be used. But it wasn't, and the question then becomes, in terms of geopolitical interest, what is it doing for the US? So if we all acknowledge that the main overwhelming US/Western interest in the Middle East is petroleum, which is what all the US officials and all the National Security Council documents that I've seen all say the same thing: petroleum. Control the petroleum, control the petroleum, control the petroleum, the resources, the distribution, and so on, and preventing the Soviets from acquiring a foothold in the Middle East. This is the overarching discourse of US interest in the region. Given that interest, isn't it interesting that when petroleum was actually threatened, the US domination of the Middle East was threatened, with the Iranian Revolution on the one hand, and then with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on the other, the US kept Israel out. It's the US that went in to defend its petroleum interests. And in fact, they told the Israelis, you stay out. And so the entire US discourse throughout the Cold War is two streams. There's one, this geopolitical interest of oil, stability, quote unquote stability, anti-democracy, of course, based on keeping everyone quiet and keeping the system totally unequal, and getting men that you can control and families that you can control in various states. That was the main US geopolitical interest. On the other hand, you had this Israel interest, which was driven overwhelmingly by domestic interests. And they were always kept in parallel, which is why the US then developed this whole discourse of being an honest broker to reconcile these two streams. After the Cold War and the collapse of the Arab states, in effect, in any kind of Arab military opposition, these things fused, and that's where we see them today. So that's the beginning of an answer. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I just think that the geopolitical interest doesn't explain the discourse and the level of commitment that we've seen. I think there are other questions. And I think in the US case, I don't know, Canada may be different, but I think domestic interest pressures, and not just lobbying as in, buying politicians the way AIPAC does, for example, but actual social movements and investment in this idea of Israel and what it means, I think is something that you can't ignore. I think that's much more, and the military-industrial complex, I guess, selling weapons and so on and so forth, that's also a crucial element, but that doesn't, again, explain necessarily Israel, because the US sells tons of weapons to the Saudis and so on and so forth, and to other states. So it's an interesting question. I think for me, it's a combination of things. That's.
We have about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is maybe collect a few questions just so that we can get more voices from the audience, and then you can have the last word, okay? So in the back, and then we'll go to Dallas for the beginning.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding, so you said you see a generational shift in favor of, let's say, of pro-Palestinian, and I would say maybe it's rather the opposite that's happening now in Europe. And so I was wondering to what extent you could break down for us this kind of Western perspective, and if you would see a realignment on the position between the US basically and Europe after the 2010s, because of the rise of global Islamist terrorism, and to what extent it is used to target Palestinians as terrorists. Thank you.
And then Dallas.
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk. So you laid out super effectively how all the founders of Zionism think of it as a colonial project. That's totally without a doubt. It was striking in light of this sort of current, particularly cynical kind of hasbara that you hear now, which is that the formation of the State of Israel was itself an anti-colonial project after 2,000 years of Arab colonialism, right? So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about if you have a sense of when that narrative emerges and how centrally you see it to the current project of Israeli propaganda, which wants to have its cake and eat it too, with Netanyahu both describing Israelis as the native population and as the bastion of Western civilization.
Can we squeeze in one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, yes. I don't know if you have the time for this, but I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on, as a historian, on your idea of humanism. In the sense that, as I understood it in your talk, humanism, Philo-Semitic humanism is very much the target and the object of critique, but the counterpoint to that is a different kind of humanism. I don't know if to call it historicizing humanism, that you said should attribute empathy to Palestinians. Or maybe we can call it Ottoman humanism because of the way you opened the talk. This calls for longer discussion, but I am not so sure that the two forms of humanism can be disentangled so directly one from each other. It's a problem of scope. Who can be Greek, let's say, but the question of humanism maybe remains.
Should I answer? So thank you for those questions. In terms of Europe, that's a very good, I can't remember the person, where she was. She was up there. In terms of Europe, the question about a shift, in other words, there is obviously in Europe this politically a right-wing shift in as the person said, an anti-migrant, anti-immigrant discourse, xenophobia, racism, that's very clear, and that ties in very clearly, as it does in other parts, in America as well, with the conservative, with the racist movement in the United States, with the right-wing movement. It ties in very nicely in terms of, like, nicely as in quotation marks, the Islamophobia, the racism, it ties in. So you're asking to what extent is there a generation shift? You would know more than me. I don't know about Europe in terms of, but my sense that there's also a struggle in Europe as well. I mean, there's Spain, there's Ireland, there's There's France. I mean, so Europe itself is not simply monolithic in terms of its thing. So, but it's an interesting question to see what happens and how the struggle develops in Europe on the question of anti-Palestinianism as a phenomenon that unifies and whitewashes, in a sense, the extreme racism of so many people in Europe and America by pretending to be philo-Semitic. And that's because that's the whole point. What's happening now is that there's a shift. If you support Israel, no matter how actually anti-Semitic you are and racist you are, you're given a pass because you support Israel. But if you, and that's what's happening, and that's what we can see that happening. That doesn't mean it's going to necessarily succeed, but it's an interesting question, and we'd have to wait, because I don't know enough about Europe, but it's a very interesting question. In terms of Zionism as a national liberation movement, yes, there's a very quick answer, and there are historians who've worked on that question of Zionism as a in the discourse of a national liberation movement. It certainly wasn't in the 19th century, and it wasn't in the 1920s, and it wasn't in the 1930s, and it wasn't in the 1940s, and it wasn't in. It began in the after Bandung, when after African states achieved independence and decolonization, then Israel tried to posit itself as a national liberation movement to seize that idea and to try to change it. At the same time, ironically, as Israel deepened its relationships with apartheid South Africa. And so the contradictions, I mean, it's such a flagrantly absurd argument, both in the sense that a national liberation movement on someone else's land is not a national liberation movement. But seriously, I understand, of course, the argument, the ideological argument, of course, that is the land but that, again, is a central claim of Zionism. So look at the central claim of Zionism, both in its iteration, the propagandist iteration as a national liberation movement, and in its iteration as a colonial movement, and understand the same premise. This is our land in perpetuity. And we are the natives here in a certain kind of way, even when we acknowledge that there are natives actually there. And to me, it's as I said, 1950s onwards, really 1960s onwards. And it goes very much out of, it's a passing trend and phase. And it never supersedes the other discourses of Israel as a Western outpost, Israel as Western civilization, Israel as a friend of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the answer to that. In terms of the question of humanism, it's not just philo-Semitism, it's philo-Zionism. In other words, it's philo-Zionism as philo-Semitism. And of course, and that's the point when Aimé Césaire talks about pseudo-humanism, he's specifically pointing out this idea that you can't have any reconstitution of, quote, humanity, and an idea of a reconstitution of a human whole that leaves out the vast majority of the world. And the idea of bifurcating the fight against anti-Semitism from the fight against colonialism, which is exactly what happens after World War II, is totally unacceptable. Can they be reconciled? Of course I think they can, because you can see right now in the West that the greatest anti-Semites, the most explicit anti-Semites, are also the greatest racists. And they work together hand in hand. And so the opposition to them, the opposition to real anti-Semitism, it seems to me has to be in alliance with Palestinian liberation. That's the only. But beyond humanism as a question, I'm not a philosopher, and there are people who would be much more able than me to talk about that in more eloquent terms. But I certainly do not believe that one can genuinely be opposed to anti-Semitism today and not be for Palestinian liberation. They really go together. It's so obvious. And as I said, the proof is in how many right-wing movements around the world, truly racist movements around the world, especially in Europe, but not just in Europe, in India as well, in other parts of the world, that are explicitly supremacist and aligned with Israel.
I'd like to thank Professor Makdisi. I know that there are many people who did not get to we have to give up the room now. So thank you, Professor Makdisi. Thank you all for coming. If we did not have a chance to get to your question, I apologize. we might be able to gather in the hall, and you might be able to address Professor Makdisi individually. Thank you. Thank you, Ussama. That was fun. There's too much. You put it